The cabin stood alone at the edge of a narrow valley where the mountains pressed close and the wind never seemed to rest. Evelyn Hart had built it with her own hands the summer before, stacking rough pine logs and sealing the gaps with mud and moss. It wasn't pretty, but it was all she had. A single room, one small window, a door that groaned every time the wind leaned against it. Her daughter Lily was 7 years old and already too familiar with silence. She moved through the cabin with careful steps, as if loud sounds might wake the cold waiting outside. In the mornings, she helped her mother shake frost from the blankets and sweep snow that slipped in through the cracks. In the evenings, she sat near the fire with a thin book in her lap, pretending to read while listening to the wind howl across the valley. Evelyn's husband had ridden east in late summer, promising work and money and a quick return. By October, the trail had vanished under the first snow. By November, Evelyn stopped looking for him. Winter had arrived early and without mercy. The valley became a corridor of frozen air, funneling icy gusts straight into their cabin walls. Some nights, the cold felt like a living thing, pressing inward with slow, patient force. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and pine. Two rope beds rested against the far wall, their mattresses stuffed with dry grass. A crooked table sat near the window, holding sacks of beans and cornmeal that looked smaller every week. The fireplace was their heart and their enemy. Feeding it meant warmth, but every log burned was one less for later. Lily never complained. She learned to split kindling with a small hatchet, her movements careful and precise. She learned to bank the fire at night, tucking ash over glowing coals like a blanket. She learned how to read the sky, how pale light meant snow, and how sharp air meant colder nights ahead. Her quiet strength unsettled Evelyn more than fear ever could. One morning, Evelyn woke before dawn to a bitter stillness. The fire had gone out during the night. Frost clung to the inside of the walls like white scars. Her fingers burned as she rebuilt the flame, blowing gently until the wood caught. When the fire finally rose, she wrapped Lily in a blanket and pulled her close. They sat together in the thin warmth, listening to the wind scrape across the roof. Evelyn stared at the woodpile through the window. It looked smaller than it had the day before, smaller than it should have been. A hard truth settled in her chest. They were losing. No matter how carefully she rationed the fire, no matter how many hours she spent chopping wood, winter was winning. The cold was endless. Her strength was not. She pressed her forehead against the glass and whispered, "We can't keep fighting it like this." Lily looked up at her, eyes dark and steady. "Then what do we do, Mama?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She watched the pale morning light creep across the valley, touching the south wall of the cabin. For a moment, that wall looked almost warm. And though she didn't yet know how, she felt something shift inside her. A small, stubborn spark of defiance. Maybe the cold wasn't the only force at work in this valley. Maybe something else could be used. Something they had been ignoring all along. Winter settled into the valley like it had claimed the place as its own. Day after day, the sky stayed pale and hard, and the wind never seemed to tire. Evelyn's world narrowed to three things: the fire, the woodpile, and Lily. Every morning began the same way. She woke before the sun, when the cabin felt like a box of frozen air. The fire had usually burned down to gray ash in a few stubborn coals. She knelt in front of the hearth, coaxing life back into it with dry twigs and careful breath. The first flames always came slow, like they were unsure whether they wanted to live. When they finally caught, she held her hands out and waited for feeling to return to her fingers. Keeping the fire alive became a kind of discipline. Too little wood, and the cold crept in through the walls. Too much, and the pile outside shrank faster than she could replace it. She fed the flames in small, cautious pieces, like she was rationing time itself. Lily learned the rhythm quickly. She brought in kindling from under the eaves, her boots crunching on snow that sounded like breaking glass. She stacked the pieces by size just the way her mother showed her. At night, she helped bank the coals, smoothing ash over them so they would last until morning. It was a quiet partnership, built from necessity and trust. But the numbers didn't lie. By mid-December, Evelyn could see the truth in the woodpile. It had looked generous in the fall, tall and solid and full of promise. Now it sagged in the middle, uneven and thinning. Each log she carried inside felt heavier than the last, not just in her arms but in her thoughts. Some nights the wind howled so loud it shook the door on its hinges. The sound worked into her bones, making sleep feel dangerous. She lay awake listening, counting breaths, counting weeks, counting the pieces of wood left in her mind. Lily slept beside her, wrapped in every blanket they owned, her small body curled tight like she was trying to conserve heat in her dreams. On one of the coldest mornings yet, Evelyn woke to silence. No crackle, no glow. The fire was dead. The cabin was so cold that frost had formed along the inside seams of the logs. Her breath came out in clouds. Her hands trembled as she struck the match. It took 3 tries before the flame stayed. When the fire finally caught, she sat back on her heels, dizzy with relief and fear all at once. Lily crawled out from the bed and came to her without a word, pressing close to the heat. Evelyn wrapped an arm around her daughter and stared into the flames. This was the moment she could no longer ignore. She was losing strength. Her shoulders ached constantly. Her palms were split and raw from hauling wood and swinging the axe. The cold demanded more than she could give. It wasn't just the fire that needed feeding. It was the winter itself, and it never seemed satisfied. She felt the weight of it in her chest, a slow, pressing doubt. What if she couldn't keep Lily warm? What if she misjudged the wood, and they ran out before the season broke? These were not dramatic fears. They were practical ones, real ones. That afternoon, while Lily mended a torn mitten, Evelyn stood by the window and looked at the valley. The sun was out, weak but bright, hanging low over the southern ridge. Its light struck the side of the cabin and stayed there, turning the dark logs a softer shade. She pressed her palm against the inside wall. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't as cold as the rest of the room either. The thought came quietly, almost without words. Fire was not the only thing that made heat. She didn't know what to do with that idea yet. All she knew was that cutting more wood would not save them. Fighting the cold with muscle alone was a battle she could not win. That night, as Lily slept, Evelyn sat awake and watched the fire burn low. For the first time, she didn't ask how long the wood would last. She asked herself a different question. What if there was another way? The next morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of winter day that looked harmless until you stepped outside. The sky was a hard blue, and the snow reflected light so brightly it hurt Evelyn's eyes. She stood in the doorway with her coat pulled tight, studying the valley like it might finally give her an answer. That was when she noticed it again. The south side of the cabin looked different in sunlight. Not brighter, softer. The logs there held the light longer, as if they were slow to let it go. She walked along the wall and pressed her palm against the wood. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't frozen either. Inside, Lily sat at the table breaking dried beans into a bowl. "Mama," she said, "it's not as cold by the window today." Evelyn glanced toward the small square of glass. A thin stripe of sunlight lay across the floor, catching dust in the air. She knelt and held her hand in it. There was a faint heat there, weak but real. The thought that had hovered the night before finally took shape. Fire wasn't the only thing that made warmth. She remembered her father's forge from when she was a girl. The way dark iron would glow after sitting in the sun, how hot air always climbed upward, no matter how cold the day was. Heat didn't disappear, it moved. And if it moved, maybe it could be guided. All morning she watched the light. She tracked how the sun rose over the ridge and slid across the south wall of the cabin. It stayed there for hours before the mountains swallowed it again in the late afternoon. 6 hours, maybe more on a clear day. 6 hours of something she had never tried to use. By noon, an idea had settled into her mind. Not fully formed, but stubborn. "What if," she said aloud, "we could trap it?" Lily looked up. "Trap what?" "The sun." Lily blinked. "You can't trap the sun." Evelyn almost smiled. "No, but maybe we can trap what it leaves behind." She began to picture it as she worked. Some kind of small room built against the south wall. A space that could catch the sunlight and hold it, instead of letting it blow away in the wind. A place where air could warm up, then rise into the cabin. Hot air went up, cold air sank. That much she knew for certain. If she could make a place for warm air to rise from, and a place for cold air to sink into, maybe the air itself would do the work. She spent the afternoon walking the length of the wall, counting steps, measuring with her eyes. She studied where the snow melted first and where it stayed longest. The south wall always cleared before the rest. By evening, her plan felt less like a dream and more like a risk she might have to take. Lily watched her draw lines in the dirt with a stick. "Is it going to help us?" Evelyn hesitated. The honest answer was she didn't know. "I think it might," she said, "but it has to be built right." That night, while the fire crackled low, Evelyn lay awake listening to the wind. The old fear was still there. The fear of running out of wood, of running out of strength, of failing the one person who depended on her. But there was something else now. A different kind of tension. Not dread, expectation. She wasn't planning how to survive the cold anymore. She was planning how to outthink it. And by the time the fire faded into embers, she had made her choice. They would stop fighting winter with fire alone. They would try to use the only thing that still showed up every clear day: the sun. Evelyn began the next morning with an axe in her hands and a plan in her head. The south wall of the cabin waited in the pale winter light, dark with old pitch and smoke. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the cold seep through her boots, then lifted the blade and struck. She cut 2 holes through the logs, one high near the roof and one low near the floor. The work was slow and punishing. Each swing sent a shock through her arms, but she kept going, pausing only to warm her hands by the fire Lily tended inside. The openings were small, just wide enough for air to pass, but they looked enormous to Lily. "You're making the cabin leak," Lily said softly. "Only for a little while," Evelyn replied, "and only in the right places." Over the next days, she built a narrow structure against the south wall using leftover poles and scrapboards. It leaned outward like a crooked porch, sloping down toward the snow. The roof was the hardest part. She had no glass. What she did have were sacks of cloth and a jar of animal fat she had saved since fall. She stretched the fabric tight across a wooden frame and brushed it with melted fat until it turned pale and translucent, stiffening as it cooled. Inside the new space, she mixed chimney soot with oil and painted every surface black: the floor, the walls, even the inside of the roof. The room looked strange, like a cave made of wood and shadow. When she finished, Lily stood beside her and frowned. "It looks like something that shouldn't be there." Evelyn wiped her hands on her skirt. "That's usually how new things look." The first night, she plugged the holes in the cabin wall with cloth and bark, afraid the cold would pour straight through. Neither of them slept well. The wind rattled the new roof, and snow whispered against the fabric. At dawn, the sky was clear. Evelyn pulled the plugs from the holes and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The sun climbed slowly over the ridge, brushing light across the dark little room outside. Evelyn sat near the upper hole, her hands clasped tight in her lap. This was a mistake, she thought. I've wasted days we didn't have. Then she felt it. A faint breath of warmer air touched her knuckles. She leaned closer. The air moving into the cabin through the upper hole was not cold. It wasn't hot either, but it was warmer than the room. "Lily," she said, her voice tight, "come here." Lily knelt beside her and held out her hand. "It's different," she whispered. Evelyn moved to the lower opening. Cool air was slipping out of the cabin, drawn into the dark room beyond. The loop was forming on its own. Warm air rising, cold air sinking, the cabin breathing. By noon, the change was undeniable. The fire had burned low, yet the room felt gentle instead of bitter. Lily took off her coat and sat at the table without shivering. Evelyn pressed her palm against the south wall. The wood was warm enough to sting. Her knees gave out, and she sat on the floor. For the first time in weeks, the cold was not winning. Tears came without warning. She pulled Lily close, and they sat together in the strange new quiet. The quiet of a room that no longer felt like it was trying to kill them. "It works," Lily said. "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "It does." They didn't trust it right away. On cloudy days, the warmth was weaker, and the fire still mattered. But even then, the cabin held heat longer than before. On clear days, the flames went out by themselves and were not missed. Evelyn kept notes on scraps of paper: how warm the room felt, how much wood she used, how long the sun stayed. She treated the little sunroom like a living thing, learning its moods, listening to what it could and could not do. Winter had not changed, but their way of meeting it had. And that made all the difference. Winter did not disappear. The wind still tore through the valley, and the nights still came early and sharp. But inside the cabin, something had changed. The cold no longer ruled every hour. On clear days, Evelyn let the fire die down after breakfast. Sunlight poured into the dark little room she had built, and warm air flowed quietly into the cabin as if the house itself had learned how to breathe. Lily moved around without her coat for the first time all season. She sat at the table and drew pictures with a stub of charcoal. Pictures of the sun, always the sun. They still used the fire on cloudy days and during storms. But the woodpile stopped shrinking so fast. By late winter, Evelyn realized they would not run out. The fear that had lived in her chest since November finally loosened its grip. The first visitor came on a bright afternoon, a trapper passing through the valley. He stood in the doorway, staring at the cool fireplace and the warm air around him. "You sick?" he asked. "Why ain't your fire going?" Evelyn showed him the sunroom. She explained the black walls, the cloth roof, the two holes in the cabin. He touched the south wall and pulled his hand back in surprise. "I've been fighting winter with an axe for 20 years, he said slowly. "Never thought to fight it with light. Word traveled the way it always does in hard places. By mouth, by memory, by people who needed something to believe in." A week later, another man rode in to see it, then a family from over the ridge. Evelyn didn't draw plans. She explained the reason behind it. Warm air rises, dark surfaces hold heat, and the sun comes whether you ask for it or not. By the time the snow began to soften, two more cabins in the valley had their own versions of her strange little room. Spring arrived quietly. Meltwater sang in the creek, and the south wall of the cabin no longer burned her hand when she touched it. The woodpile still held enough for the cold nights that lingered into April. One morning, a letter came from the town downriver. It carried the news Evelyn had already felt in her bones. Her husband had died the winter before in a mining accident. She read the words once and folded the paper. There were no tears left for that grief. She had already done her mourning in the long dark weeks when survival mattered more than sorrow. Lily found her sitting by the window. "Are we okay?" she asked. Evelyn pulled her close. "We are." Years later, Lily would build her own cabin in another valley and put the sunroom on first, before she even raised the rest of the walls. She would teach her children the same lesson. You don't always survive by working harder. Sometimes you survive by seeing differently. So here's the question for you. If you were facing that winter, would you keep fighting the cold the same way everyone else did? Or would you try something new? And another question, how many solutions do we miss in our own lives just because they look strange at first? If this story made you think, if it moved you, or if it reminded you that hope can come from the simplest ideas, then you already understand why these stories matter. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional survival stories like this one. Share this story with someone who believes in second chances and quiet strength. And comment below, would you have trusted the sun or the fire? Because sometimes the thing that saves us isn't power, it's perspective.